Order, order.
Good evening, this is Sean Curran at Westminster, where MPs welcome the news that there's going to be an inquiry into the Contaminated Blood Scandal. Thousands of people were infected with diseases including HIV and hepatitis C, and more than 2,000 NHS patients died.
The worst treatment disaster in the history of our NHS, and one of the worst peacetime disasters that has ever taken place in this country.
It's been called one of the worst peacetime disasters in the UK. In the 1970s and 80s, thousands of haemophiliacs and other NHS patients were treated with contaminated blood products from abroad and infected with hepatitis C and HIV. As MPs prepared to take part in an emergency debate on the scandal, the Prime Minister announced an inquiry into what she called an appalling tragedy which should never have happened. A Health Minister, Philip Dunn, said the families of people who died would be consulted about what sort of inquiry should take place.
There have been calls for an inquiry based on the model that was used to investigate the Hillsborough tragedy, a so-called Hillsborough-style panel. This would allow for a sensitive investigation of the issues, allowing those affected and their families close personal engagement with an independent and trusted panel. There have also been suggestions that only a formal statutory inquiry led by a senior judge under the Inquiries Act 2005 will provide the answers that those affected want. Such an inquiry would have the power to compel witnesses and written evidence.
The emergency debate had been called by the Labour MP Diana Johnson, who welcomed the announcement and said she wanted a Hillsborough-style inquiry.
Honourable members and their affected constituents are entitled to ask, why has the same not happened with contaminated blood? Had more than 2,400 people died over the course of one day or 1 year, it would have been inconceivable for any government to refuse calls for a public inquiry. Yet the devastation caused by the contaminated blood scandal has been spread not over days or years, but over several decades.
She said successive governments of all colours had sidestepped the issue for too long and thanked Theresa May for ordering an inquiry.
Those affected and their families will be waiting anxiously to know that the Prime Minister's announcement will truly give them the justice they have so long been denied. But today, the Prime Minister has earned a place in history as someone who has listened to an issue which her predecessors had ignored and put party politics aside in the name of giving the people the basic right to answers, and for that she has my gratitude.
Yeah. The Liberal Democrat former Health Minister Norman Lamb said the inquiry had to take place quickly.
Whilst this is incredibly welcome news, there is also an urgency because those people who continue to suffer need help now, and there's a danger that this process could go on for years and leave them still waiting for some support.
In the 1980s, the UK imported supplies of a clotting agent from the United States, where donors, including prisoners, had sold their blood to pharmaceutical companies. Earlier this year, the Labour former Health Secretary Andy Burnham used his final speech in the Commons to claim there'd been a criminal cover-up on an industrial scale. There have been complaints that patients weren't told about the risks involved in their treatment and that warnings about the safety of the blood products were ignored. The SNP's Philippa Whitford is a former surgeon. She said there'd been a shortage of blood and clotting factors
that led to the NHS sourcing products from America. The problem is that people with haemophilia in men or von Willebrand's disease in women who get factor 9, these concentrates are made from thousands of samples. And the moment you have 1 or 2 people within that collection, you are starting to have the virus. And that's why they are affected at a much higher rate than people who had a single blood transfusion.
And she warned MPs that they shouldn't blame everything on the United States.
The UK producers have often been found wanting in the quality of product that they came up with. So we mustn't pat ourselves in the back and imagine that the UK product was somehow safe and this was all due to the US. We need to follow this right down and get the answers.
Many of the MPs who took part in this emergency 3-hour debate spoke about constituents who'd contacted them for help. A Conservative, Mims Davis, said MPs often heard heartbreaking stories.
But it's not a story for these victims. It's daily life. It's wrecked lives where nothing has been done wrong by their own accord. It is pure injustice.
A Labour MP, Jessica Morden, talked about Colin Smith from her Newport constituency. He was one of the youngest victims of the Contaminated Blood Scandal and died in 1990 when he was 7.
As Colin's tribute on the Tainted Blood website says, thousands of people like Colin didn't make it this far. He never had the chance to join the Cubs, play football for his school, have a girlfriend, go travelling or get married. Instead, his short life was filled with hospitals, doctors and illness.
A Conservative, Peter Heaton-Jones, read from an email he'd received from his constituent, Sue Threakle.
My husband, Bob, died in 1991, aged 47. Despite being a severe haemophiliac, he had lived a relatively normal life until he was given commercial blood products. Following that, his health and his life followed a deep and dark downhill path. He contracted hepatitis B, C and HIV. He died a terrible death, which I believe was wholly avoidable. He was never informed about the risks known at the time of imported factor VIII. He was never told he had hepatitis C, and indeed I only found out myself a few years ago. His HIV test result was withheld from us for many months, thus leaving me at risk. I was fortunate, but many other women were not.
Peter Heaton-Jones.